Hi, just watched the.
Hey, Vern.
Hey, Miss Nora.
How you doing? Where's the
Should I sit right here? You want me to sit on it? Oh, no, this is your tight one. How are you, Nora?
Testing.
Hi, Nancy, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Bertie. I work with Robin too. And I'm TLC. Out of my hand.
Oh, okay. There's a button on top.
Is that on? Good morning, everyone. I'm Belinda Edmondson. I am one of the organizers for this Sawyer Seminar. We are so excited to be all here and to begin this year-long series on immigration, race, and inequality in America. I'm not going to spend too much time up here, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our wonderful, transformative Chancellor, Dr. Nancy Cantor, to give the welcome.
I gotta be tippy toes here. I make these for big people. So I am absolutely delighted to say a few words of welcome as this terrific Sawyer Seminar series funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation begins. And I want to first congratulate Belinda, Sean, Cornell, Bernie for their creativity and commitment in conceiving and bringing to fruition this timely seminar. As we sit today amidst the flood of anti-immigrant sentiment, undergirded by rampant racism and xenophobia, and sustained by vicious hitting of communities by race, religion, language, and heritage. We live in a time indeed reminiscent of the nativism of Nazism, when white supremacists chant, "Jews will not replace us" on a college campus. A time when that nativism is transported to distinguish real white Americans, a group whose heritage has broadened over decades to include the Jews and Italians and Irish, once excluded as interior, and to contrast them with a broad collection of others. A collection of others that covers a wide diaspora, as you all know, full, sadly but inevitably, of its own intergroup conflicts. For example, within diaspora communities over issues such as religion, class, language, and color. We witnessed the horrendous targeting and beating of Asian Americans under the guise of blame for a global pandemic. And then we watched as a governor of a state that once welcomed Cuban refugees, albeit a specific type, uses blatant trickery to transport Venezuelan refugees seeking asylum and covered under PPS to another state where apparently he believes they better fit. Indeed, to borrow a phrase from my fellow social psychologist Rupert McCosk, our hibernating bigotry is not hibernating, and it knows no geographic boundaries and shows no shame in assigning a diverse you need and it knows no geographic boundaries. It shows no shame in assigning a diverse membership to the other, repeating the sins of historical exclusion and racist discrimination, as if we haven't learned a thing from Native American genocide, Atlantic slavery, the Chinese exclusion, forced internment of Asian Americans, and the list unfortunately goes on. Now, as the title of this seminar series, Natives and Nativists, Migrants and Immigrants in American Cities, begins, we add the dimension of urbanization, as so much of the world's population now reside in urban centers that carry their own history up to this day of exclusion and inclusion, gentrification and displacement, vibrant perseverance, and persistent systemic racism. And this brings us to Newark, New Jersey's largest city, one that to this day, as Ryan Haygood and our partners at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice say, exemplifies what MLK meant by two Americas, calling on us all to say the word reparation as we think about what reparative justice is. Indeed, I would say there cannot be a more relevant, emblematic place for this seminar's critical and timely dialogue to be held than right here, the 354 50-plus-year-old global city, where from its very start, the complexities of the all too simple binary of native and nativist, migrants and immigrants took shape as settled colonialists overran the Lenape homeland, beginning with a repeatedly thought narrative about rightful ownership. A narrative then repeated across centuries of migration and immigration up to this very day, setting the stage for the related and equally contested and complex territory of who really belongs. This is a city brought to life by waves of African-descended families migrating south of here, riding in many cases the Underground Railroad for freedom, including through what is now our Rutgers-Newark only to land in the last northern state to abolish slavery in 1866. Then came multiple generations of immigrants migrating here, from Jews and Italians and Irish challenging native misconceptions of whiteness, in Newark's Chinatown, blowing on Mulberry Street starting in the late 1870s, thriving up until the Depression, and declared dead by newspaper headlines in the 1950s. And central to the evolving complexion and complexity of this global city, of course, are decades upon decades of highly diverse populations from the global south, including, for example, those 73,000 labeled in the census as born in Latin America, covering again a wide span of geography, from Brazil and Ecuador to the Dominican Republic and beyond, and often presumed, sometimes incorrectly, to be brown. Or those coming from Africa and the Caribbean, who are distinguished from their African American neighbors, complicating the reductionist vision of a black city. Likewise, among the 108,670 Newark residents labeled in the U.S. Census as born outside of the United States, we are challenged to reach beyond yet another reduction understanding of Newark's 6,500 residents labeled as born in Asia, which occupy similarly the broad array of ethnicities, religions, social classes, and cultural traditions of the first-generation residents of our city, offering. Indeed, movement in and out of Newark has defined its soul and culture and economic trajectory, especially when the Black and Puerto Rican rebellions of 1967 and 1974, respectively, gave cover to decades of so-called white flight, which included many of the successful residents of Newark's former Chinatown and dispersed in New Jersey's many suburbs. In turn, these movements in and out of Newark turned New Jersey's largest city, on the one hand, into a diverse mecca for nuanced and vibrant cultural, linguistic, and religious representation, and on the other hand, a transportation hub for thousands of suburban, mostly white, employees of Fortune 500 companies and universities and hospitals, commuting in and then out of Newark every day. Yes, in so many ways, as our dear late city historian and revered Rutgers-Newark colleague insightfully said, and I quote, all roads lead to Newark. And I echo that sentiment today in order to emphasize the dynamic the landscape is and has always been, even as the external labeling is typically reductionistic, glossing over the ever-present whole characteristics of Newark residents and the communities who populate most urban cities. Nevertheless, at the heart of so much of the tension of urbanization, evident in Newark and other comparable cities, is the age-old question of who owns the city. To whom does it belong? Alongside the question of who profits from its economy versus who has built its soul. Who owns Newark? Who owns America? As simple as the question may seem, I see it as the door to be opened as this seminar considers the fundamental tension of race, inequality, and immigration that confront us and animate us all so urgently today, and that scholars and students at Rutgers-Newark have been studying and living for decades. I see it in the questions that our undocumented students, our dreamers, ask as we work to ensure their belonging in this field. I hear it in the voices of our 480 and more students speaking 48 languages in the Lines and Translation program, working in the immigration rights field, and in contact with them. I watch it in the multimedia stories of the North Americans, produced as the story bus travels the neighborhoods of Europe, and makes maps that connect local to global in the Mediterranean distinction. I moved to it and to have culture of Newark's legacies, our creative writing faculty and students in our institute, jazz studies, artists, collaborated and just jazz musicians, city groups, reminding us that sound and words exactly who has been in Newark for so long. And speaking of being in and of Newark, I nod my head and heart to our public historians working to underscore the rightful presence of the Underground Railroad in Newark as our socially engaged artists define the sights and sounds of the new main Harriet Public Square after the removal of the famous statue. Again reminding us of centuries of conflict over who owns and who belongs. And speaking of ownership and belonging and urbanization, I read with sadness the latest report from our crime scholars entitled Who Owns Newark, documenting the destructive influence of outside investors, buying up Newark's homes and displacing real Newarkers by charging exorbitant rents. Yes, the story of systemic racism created to America goes way back in our community. As our scholars in the Inclusion Project studying school segregation by race and class remind us that New Jersey has the 6th most segregated public schools in the country. And as we see in every corner of every neighborhood, in our crafting democratic futures project, a collaboration between our public historians and community partners at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Newark and AAPI, and the Newark Community Development Network, committed to the campaign to save the world for reparations and restorative justice, which must be spoken as part of this dialogue too. I mention all of these ways that we interrogate with so many angles, disciplines, viewpoints, communities, as this series will do, the pressing question, pressing now but rooted in history, of how and why, and to what end have we pitted and reduced, excluded so many people under the rubric of discriminating between and amongst those seen as belonging and those to whom the door of equitable growth is closed. Having these conversations will sometimes be difficult and always challenging as we confront the past and equally fraught present. Yet as this series goes forth and complicates the binaries of natives and nativists, migrants and immigrants, it will also possibly open some doors to a better way to answer the question of who owns America. A way perhaps that it will genuinely represent the American ethos of brutalization, even as that feels today a long way off. In this regard, I turn to a quote from Frederick Douglass that needed to tell you to begin his book, Out of Many Faiths, Religious Diversity in the American Context. In the words of Frederick Douglass, quote, there is but one destiny left for us, and that is to make ourselves and be made by others a part of the American people, in every sense of the word. I see the dialogue to come here as asking a bit of that question. How can we be us and still be we here? Thank you for this seminar.
Thank you, Chancellor Cantor. I have a very great pleasure today to introduce our speakers. Cathy Park Hong is one of the most important voices in Asian American studies today. She is a brilliant poet and essayist whose writing has appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, and Salon, among other media outlets. Cathy is the author of the best-selling Minor Feelings and Asian American Reckoning. She's a tour de force book of essays I highly recommend everybody read on the Asian American experience, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She's been on the cover of Time. There's a huge spread of her, what New York Magazine just today. She's awesome. She is a luminous presence in the English department here at Rutgers-Newark, where she co-directs the MFA program. I'm proud to call her my colleague. Welcome, Cathy. Ngai is a renowned historian who examines issues of immigration, citizenship, nationalism, and the Chinese diaspora. She teaches at Columbia University, where she is the Lum Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History. An essayist who has written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Atlantic, among other outlets, Professor Ngai is the author of several award-winning books. Among these, Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens in the Making of Modern America, The Lucky Ones, One Family, and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, and The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes, and Global Politics. And currently she's working on Nation of Immigrants, A Short History of an Idea, which is under contract with Princeton University Press. She also has an amazing essay out in the Atlantic right now, I believe. Again, if you don't know the work, go and read. Of particular interest for me and for our community here in Newark is that Professor Ngai did not go directly to college. Before becoming an historian, she was a labor union organizer and an educator in New York City, where when she finally enrolled in college, she did not go to a wealthy private institution, but to Empire State College, part of the SUNY system. Professor Ngai, in other words, could have been a student here at Newark. She is a testament to public education as a public good. I'm thrilled that she is here with us today. Welcome, Professor. Moderating the talk between Cathy and May will be Professor Rose Quizon-Villazor, who specializes in immigration law here in Newark at the Rutgers Law School, where she is the interim dean. She has written op-eds for the New York Times and appeared on CNN and other media outlets. She's the founding director of our Center for Immigration Law, Policy, and Social Justice, a very important center for the kind of transformative work we need to do here. Please welcome, Rose.
More than.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, May and Cathy. Thank you so much for being here today. So I have the privilege of moderating this panel, and it's really my job to feature the incredible work that both Cathy and May are doing. So let's begin. Why don't we just start first, generally talking about how you see your own role in education and in public life. May?
Well, first, thank you for having me. Thanks to Belinda and Cornell and Sarah Durst, and thank you, Chancellor Cantor. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me just first say that when you say my role as an educator or a researcher and in public life, those are two things that don't go easily together necessarily. And I think of myself more as a former, as a scholar. But as a scholar and as a citizen, you know, we have a responsibility to the public good. But that's not always comfortable, it's not always easy to do. I was reading this fabulous profile of Cathy in New York yesterday, and it described her as a reluctant pundit. And I understand that, I totally get that. I personally am suspicious of the eager pundit. So, but I think, you know, we need to try to bring what we can to the public conversation. So, you know, that world of journalism or op-eds, you know, moves in a different rhythm. You know, I took a decade to write a book. You want something in the Times, you have to write it last night. So it's a very different kind of thing. So to balance those things, I think is also always a challenge for us.
Hi. First of all, thank you, Sawyer, the conference, and Belinda, and Cornell, and Rose, and everyone who helped organize this. And I have to say, it's really a special treat to be here on stage with May, who is absolutely seminal in Asian American Studies as both a scholar and as an activist. And I don't know where you would be today without May and her work. So it's an honor to be here. I also hesitate from this idea of having a role. You know, I constantly emphasize that I'm a poet, and I went to graduate school as a poet, and you know, poets are used to having no audience, you know, and we poets have no cultural capital, but you know, but what poets do are, you know, they allow readers to be wakeful, or be aware of what language can do and how it could, and to make us more sensitive to the world around us. That's what writers do. And so that has always been my motivation. Now, if we are to kind of think about it within the realm of Asian American studies or race studies and so forth, you know, for me, as I would say, like, as a, you know, a literary activist or advocate, for me, it was really important to kind of unpack the canon and point to other forms of literature that have been hidden by Western hegemony and so forth. And you know, Ngai talks about you know, how people who have been othered, you know, are poets who have been othered have made a lot of innovations, like quote unquote othering language, othering literature. And I've always been specialized in that. That is quite different from being thrust more in the spotlight as after Minor Feelings came out, where people have expected me to have be a talking head and have like thoughts on anti-Asian hate and so forth. And I think, you know, in the 24-hour news cycle, people just want the quick opinion, the quick, they need content, constant content. And I think it's very important that, and for me, I'm not a accustomed to that, and I tend to bristle at that, but I also think it's really important for Asian Americans, myself, but also everyone to kind of take over the platform and speak up and speak out and, you know, act as a corrective against sort of these, you know, the errors of media, or the, you know, or, and so forth, and because no one else is going to do it. And that's what I realized, is that no one else is going to do it, but we have to do it ourselves. So that is, I guess, sometimes my reluctant role, I guess, when I do speak, when I take on a public role.
That does make sense though. So I remember during the Trump administration, because of the multiple anti-immigrant laws that were passed and regulations that were passed, there were protests, there were many discussions in the news. And here at Rutgers, many of us who write in this area, like the two of you, were called by CNN, New York Times to participate. And on the one hand, visibility is so important. We need to go out there. We need to share our story. But on the other hand, there's also this drawing from the reluctance theme that I'm hearing. We have to do it. In some ways, it's an obligation to do so. But then there's a part of it that, you know, that it can be burdensome. But at least the way I see it is I agree with what you're saying, Cathy. It's part of what we need to do in order to go out there and share views. Right? And do you agree with that?
I would say that we actually bring something very special to public conversation. We bring our expertise. And a lot of people who are talking heads over on the news actually are very shallow in the knowledge that they have, or they're polemicists. And I think what we bring is a very deep knowledge that may not be obvious in the soundbite or the short little column light. But I think what we bring to bear in the conversation is something that makes people think, right? Either through, in your case, right, your mastery of language, right, and then how you can deconstruct bad language, right? Because if you, that's the other side of it, right? If you're great at writing and you love and understand language, then you can really unpack bad language. And I think what historians bring to the table is a deep knowledge of how we got here, and how we can actually learn from the past. And in some ways, I think where the burden becomes more worrisome is when we are expected to be prescriptive. I don't have the answers, right? We don't have all the answers, but we can bring something to the conversation that can help a collective discussion that maybe we could reach together some kind of solutions or answers. But I think that whether you're talking about laws or history of Asian Americans or immigrants or language, I think we actually as scholars and professionals, we bring something to the conversation that actually is not always there. So I think that's why we do it. Not just so we can add a voice, but so I don't write about anything that's not historical. I'm not an elected official, I'm not a public figure, you know, that's what I can bring to the conversation is something historical. So I'm very careful not to write about just anything, because people ask me to write about all kinds of things. And I don't, because I don't think that's really what I can contribute. So I think that's what we have to offer.
Well, let's continue talking about history first, and then we'll turn, of course, and these conversations. I'd love to hear your thoughts too on this, Cathy. And in a room full of historians, this question might be a bit provocative, but I think it's worth talking about. Is there too much history when we talk about the present day of Asian American, anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian sentiment? Some might say that we're talking too much about history, not enough about the present. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Both of your work address the question of history.
Last time, I mean, the obvious answer is no, right? Because even if I weren't talking to a room full of historians, I would say no. You know, I'm with Walter Benjamin here. I mean, it's like you have to, the past is the present. You bring the past into the present to understand the future, or understand what the future is. I think the problem is, I think quite the opposite, that there's not enough history. We are deficient. And I would say that especially in this age of digital capitalism, we've had sort of this opposite that everything is archived, but nothing is remembered, nothing is known. We have this influx or this superfluous information, but that's not actually metabolized into actual knowledge. And knowledge is what we use as a wisdom to make wise decisions. And there's just, of course, it's insufficient, And in terms of, and I would say especially in terms of the studies now, we are thankful to have historians like you who are able to go, like your last book, who are able to kind of even say the gold rush and Chinese migration to global racial capitalism, and we need more in-depth scholarship like that, and there has been. There needs to be more. I was listening to NPR, and this was my experience when I was in high school, like where, there was, someone was saying this, and I had the same experience, where you had an American, you had like a home-sized American history book, and what was devoted to Asian American history was like a paragraph. And maybe it got a little bit better, but then, even though there is this kind of need to, the paragraph is kind of to a page, now we're seeing, right-wing America fighting against that, just even for a little bit more inclusion, but, talking about critical race theory and how it's destroying America and so forth. So it's a constant battle, to really understand. And it's also about just audience, perhaps we have a lot of history in this room, but I would say for the most part, if we're talking about a general American audience, if we're talking about younger Americans, they don't have access to truth, to what the foundation of America really was. So, the answer is no.
Well, some of you will know that there's the controversy of the American Historical Association recently, where the president wrote a column criticizing historians for being presentist, and what he meant by that was that their writings were too much shaped by our concerns of the present. Now, that's actually not what presentism is. I'm surprised that he kind of got that a little wrong. Presentism is kind of a sin in the historical profession, and what we mean by that is that we write about the past as though it were the present, because we all live in the present. Nobody, including historians, actually lives in the past. It's gone. You're dead. It's over. So we can't go there literally. We go there through archives, through other kinds of textual materials. And the questions we ask are obviously informed by the present, because this is our time. I can't ask a question based on what people 50 years ago or 100 years ago were thinking. I can think about what they might be thinking, but my own subject position is here and now. So there's no way you can avoid being in the present, but that always shapes the questions that we ask about the past. So that's not what presentism is. Presentism is when you impose on the past a set of conclusions based on the present, and that's a very different kind of problem. So this controversy about presentism then spilled over into, social media platforms, spilled over into the New York Times, where I won't name names, but somebody said, well, we should be talking about why immigrants are being killed, and yet people are writing about gold miners. Now, I took that personally, just because I just wrote a book about the gold rushes. But my purpose in writing that book was not to supplant any discussion or analysis of what's happening today. If anything, I think people were interested in my book because it helps illuminate the origins of racial ideas about Asians and Chinese. So it was kind of a snarky dig that was made, but I think it really confused what historians bring to the table, because we bring something that helps people understand the past, which then can help us understand what kind of choices we have today. It's not so much that it tells us what to do, but my point in that book was to show that racism against Chinese was not something, innate in white people, that it's not something that's up in a cloud and you can just download the app for anti-Chinese racism anywhere, anytime. It's produced historically by politics. And if it's a political question, then we have and people had choices, right? What kind of political path they want to pursue. And so to me, that's my message, is that we have a choice today in terms of how we want to see our country go, how we want the world to go. And we have to make that choice. It's a different kind of choice, but it's a choice between democracy and white supremacy, or between democracy and authoritarianism. That's our choice today. So I don't have the answer to that, but my purpose was not to supplant any discussion at the present, but to have history help us have that conversation.
We actually had Professor Ngai serve as a distinguished lecturer of the Center for Immigration Law Policy and Justice last fall, but because of the pandemic, we had to have the talk, her lecture through Zoom. And so it's just great to be part of this conversation with the two of you. As we continue talking about history versus presentism, Cathy, I wanted to ask you, both of you have been doing a lot of talks the last few years on your most recent books. In one of your essays, in the third essay, I believe, from your book, White Innocence, The End of White Innocence, I'm struck by how that particular essay helps us to address this question about where does history fit in? Should history fit in the way that we talk about present issues today? Could you just say a little bit more about how you see that particular essay, End of White Innocence, what role that plays in today's discussions about anti-Asian immigrants, and how we might understand, just in general, ongoing racial discrimination against people of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think End of White Innocence is an essay that doesn't really actually introduce any new ideas. It's more my own personal kind of entwining my own kind of personal memories with this notion of white innocence. And of course, there are plenty of scholars and historians who have already spoken about white innocence, Baldwin, Mel Painter, any number of scholars of white studies. But I guess what I was, the title is End of White Innocence, and basically I was maybe it's addressing this notion of presentism, but this kind of willful ignorance of white America, of understanding only one kind of history, one that is it's basically the white innocence that a lot of these critics of critical race studies want to be taught in schools, where racism was solved in the civil rights movement, and everything has been hunky-dory since. And in fact, it hasn't been that, but it's also what I've been taught in school as well, which is, the foundation of was a democracy, slavery ended, everything was great, and so forth. And that has also, I guess, influenced literature too. And you know, in the essay, I talk about mid-century American literature by a lot of white authors. Like an example would be John Cheever. I used the example of The Graduate, Mike Nichols' The Graduate, and how many of these movies and books sort of see America as a kind of screen memory of nostalgia, you know, and their understanding of America is very much about their own childhood, the innocence of their own childhood and how that is vanishing. And my thinking is like, well, what is that about? Because I didn't have this innocent childhood. And I think innocence is something that is, people assume that childhood innocence is universal, but of course it's not. It's based on your socio-demographic position, you know, whether you're Black or brown, Asian, but also your economic background. And, you know, innocence is based on the idea of where you think, you know, it's based on the song, free to be you and me, you could be whoever you want, right? And this notion of white innocence had to do with, like, I could be anyone I want. Therefore, and this is a kind of a worldview that is universal. And not thinking of whiteness as a racial category. And that has changed, as we have seen, you know, I mean, that is, I think, and that was when, especially within the last few years, especially since like 2016, since the election of Trump, where white America has been made aware of their racial identity, and being made aware of them, they think it's a form of oppression. And so this is where we have been getting a lot of blowback in politics and so forth. And so that essay was my kind of personal experience, my own sort of personal take on that. And I guess my interest in that essay was, well, what's going to happen to whiteness? You know, and this was actually, I started that essay before Trump got elected, before January 6th and everything else that has happened then. Because, you know, in like 2040 or so, the minorities will be the majority of America. So how is that going to change racial politics? Is that going to change racial politics? Is whiteness going to be? Whiteness is also very, you know, as we know, it's malleable, right? You know, Jews and Russians were not white, but now they are. You know, will Asians be white? I don't think so. I don't think that's the case. But these are sort of the questions that I grapple with in that essay.
Hearing you talk about whether Asians can be white, I'm reminded of the two Supreme Court cases in the 1920s in which the Supreme Court was faced with the question by a Japanese American and a South Asian Indian as to whether they're white. I recall that the Bagadin versus United States and Ozawa versus United States. And so as the lawyer, law professor, I'll just share a little bit about it, and then would love to hear your thoughts about, is it possible for the meaning of whiteness to evolve in some ways to incorporate Asians? So in the Thin, we'll start with Ozawa, right? Ozawa came first. So in the Ozawa case, he argued that he asked the court to declare that he's white because if he was a white immigrant, he can apply for citizenship. And at the time, there were only two racial groups who were eligible to apply for citizenship: white immigrants. And then after the Civil War, those of African descent were then given the opportunity to apply for citizenship. So only those two categories, racial groups. In the 1920s, at this time, there were already Chinese immigrants, Japanese Americans, and South Asian immigrants, Filipinos, not eligible for citizenship. And so the question was, well, that Mr. Ozawa argued, can I be white because my skin is white? I am I'm arguably white, and so therefore apply for citizenship. And the case went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. Court said, no, you're not who we popularly understand as white. Whiteness, being white means you're Caucasian. 3 months later, another case, a related case, went up before the US Supreme Court. Mr. Thind argued, well, I'm South Asian, high caste Punjabi, I am white, I'm Caucasian. That's scientifically who I am. And the Supreme Court then turned around and said, that's not what we mean by white, right? A white person is someone who, it doesn't matter if one is scientifically white. Instead, a white person is someone who is conventionally known as white by the framers. And so here I pointed out because judges, Supreme Court justices were instrumental in defining who was white. And then over time, in terms of naturalization, by 1952, all racial categories to citizenship were limited. But I bring back that history because judges, Supreme Court justices played a crucial role in defining who is white. And I'm just curious in your own work, whether once our idea of whiteness, and to go back to what Chancellor Cantor was talking about, who belongs, how racial categories have defined who belongs in America, and where you see your work interrogating that question of who belongs on the basis of race, and where Asian Americans fit in that question.
That's a really important question, Rose, and I think it's really complicated. You know, speaking of the Supreme Court, they're going to hear the affirmative action case this term. You're going to hear it very early in October. That's the Harvard case. And I think the Harvard case is interesting because it's, I'm sure most of you know, but for those who don't, it's the case that Asians, there are too many Asians at Harvard, and that is a discrimination. But the lawyer bringing the suit is the same lawyer who brought the suit against Michigan and Texas on behalf of white plaintiffs that said affirmative action was discrimination against whites. And now they're using Asians as a wedge to suggest that Asians, like whites, are discriminating against Blacks and Latinos. And the interesting thing is that Asian Americans, when polled, poll in favor of affirmative action. And then if you break it down by Asian ethnic groups, there's only one Asian group that opposes affirmative action. It's the Chinese. And that's because there's a preponderance of wealthy or relatively wealthy immigrants from China or Taiwan. But all the other Asian ethnic groups, whether it's Vietnamese or Filipino or whatever, they all poll in favor of. So I think that this is a side note, but I think when we talk about Asian American studies and Asian Americans, we also always have to be mindful that Asian Americans are not homogenous group, that there's ethnic differences, and there's also class differences within groups. I mean, not all Chinese are wealthy either. A lot of Chinese work in restaurants and garment factories, or homeless, you know, so we have to really pay attention to those details. But I think this is part of the history where Asians never fit comfortably in a society where race was historically defined as Black and white. Ellen Wu, who's going to be on a later panel today, has written brilliantly about that position of moving historically from definitively not white to definitively not Black. And I think that really sums up the fraught nature of Asian Americans' racial position in the American landscape. So these are all things that, you know, I mean, people, one of the things surrounding this more recent wave of violence against Asian Americans is how shocked people are. And that shock is, I think, an index of the misconception that Asian Americans don't have any problems, that they're not racially othered anymore, that they're white or white adjacent. I put that in quotes, because I hate that concept about being white adjacent. So I think these are all really complicated questions, and we no longer rely on the Supreme Court to declare racial categories. That's actually done by the OMB. The federal government has a list of minorities, and that has all kinds of implications for policy, but it's no longer up to the courts to decide what a race is. And the court is, let alone what race any particular person is, right? That's no longer something that can be litigated. And so I think identity has a much more complicated, in some ways, valence, because it's perception, it's self-perception, recognition, misrecognition, custom rather than law is what guides a lot of racial discrimination and policies. So I think I don't know how this is going to go. I think, my general opinion, what was really interesting about those two cases, let me just say this and I'll stop, is that Thind and Ozawa made two kinds of arguments when they went before the court. They made a strict legal argument, which is that I am white. Because that was, well, they could have said I am black, right? So it's important that they didn't say that, right? They said I am white. So Ozawa said, the I and you have they're really white, and Thind said I'm a Caucasian. But that wasn't the only argument they made. They also said, I'm an American because I believe in the Constitution, because I believe in the principles of this country. So they were careful not to only rely on the racial argument. They had to make that in order to have a legal case. But they also made it clear that they were, small d Democrats. That they should be included as a matter of democracy. So I think if that's our starting point, that we want to have a democratic society, and we want to redress those things that foster undemocratic norms or inequalities, then I think that's at least a starting point. But frankly, I think this whole question of where Asian, that's kind of what we learned from Cathy in her book, where do we fit in? Do we fit? We don't fit in, and therefore we're either invisible or hypervisible, right? And right now we're kind of hypervisible. So I think this is our challenge.
What I say in my book is that Asian Americans have a very conditional position where we're tolerated, which tolerance is not the same thing as acceptance, right? Like tolerance is you are, we will bear your presence until a circumstance that's often external happens, and then the blame is placed on you. And a lot of immigrants are actually put in that position quite a bit. And when I talk about Asian Americans, I'm talking about, this has been happening for this is why history is so important, right? Because we know that this has been happening for hundreds of years. And most recently, besides COVID times, was like, when there was a threat of detaining Muslims, or after 9/11, when South Asians, Muslim Americans were being targeted for this. So this is cyclical. It happens. It's like musical chairs, which ethnic group are we going to choose next? And because of this, because Asian Americans have always been in this conditional position, this is my suspicion that I don't think Asian Americans will ever become white. There's always this kind of carrot. And what Claire to this idea of between black and white, there have been a lot of scholars who've written on this, like Claire Jean Kim, who talked about how Asian Americans have always been in this very tricky, triangulated relationship between blackness and whiteness, where they have always been used as a wedge. And we're seeing that even now with the anti-Asian hate, where there's a lot of this conflict about the solution, what to do. And there are leftist Asian Americans believe that we have to find non-carceral solutions, and there are more right-wing Asian Americans who believe that we need to find carceral solutions. And then the, right-wing pundits grab onto that narrative and use or exploit, or not use Asian Americans, they're not, they have agency, they're doing this too, and use them as a reason for blaming Black Lives Matter, defunding police, and all of that. And that has been one long narrative that's been going on for a long time, and it's sometimes it seems intractable, but we have to. I think what's really, really essential. I don't have like a tactical solution to that, but I do believe that it's really essential for everyone to understand how we ended up in this country in the first place, and how we have been these like marginalized groups have been affected by whiteness, capitalism, whatever, what have you, as a way to, as a means of mind change.
What should allyship look like then? Both of you, I'm hearing echoes of the need to engage with and to collaborate, coordinate with other groups who are also have been marginalized historically. In Cathy, you said, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, what Asian American groups have protested, have joined the protests. But I guess you said there are also other, we know that there are other groups who have also joined the other side, and Blue Lives Matter. And so there's a need to engage with other groups. And but what could or should allyship look like from your perspective? See, this is great because we're making sure that we're giving each other space this week. May, you want to start?
Well, I just want to, I think we should all practice solidarity with others, with our fellow human beings and with other groups who are other racialized. So I think that's a political position, but I think it's also a humanist position. That we should be in solidarity with others, and we should be, that's what it means to be against racism. But I want to go back to the point I made a little while ago about how no ethnic group is homogeneous. There's different socioeconomic positions, different ethnicities, different politics. And I think, Asians are often described with a very broad brush as being anti-Black, as being conservative, I had an argument with somebody that said, wanting more police was reactionary. Now, I don't see having more police as the solution, but I don't think it's reactionary. That's very loaded term. So I think, and just as our communities are not of one mind, the Black community is not homogenous either. And nor is Latinos are famously diverse ethnically and politically. So I think there's a lot of simplistic thinking about race in terms of groups that, first of all, there's the divisions, right, between groups, and then each group is kind of understood as a monolith. So I think, part of our education, and I think as Cathy pointed out in one of your writings, that it's not like a competition, like who's the most oppressed. It's not a competition. I mean, we can recognize what's distinctive in different racisms and what's distinctive in the burdens of history that different groups carry. But it's not a competition. And I think if we take an approach that I think at bottom is a humanist approach, but then is also a political strategy. And I think we can say we should all be in solidarity with others. And for me to be in solidarity with, say, Black Lives Matters, I also don't feel like I have to say that before I say something about Asians. I I think some of us feel like we have to make it clear we're allies before we advocate for ourselves. And I think that puts us in a really weird position. We have to apologize for protesting our own racism that we experience. We have to apologize for it. So it's not one or the other, and I think this is all, what we're having to navigate today.
I think one of the complications of Asian American studies or Asian American conversations by a lot of people are also bristle at Asian American, anything topical with Asian America because it is such a disparate group and it's, well, there are two ethnicities and also the socioeconomic differences are innumerable among Asian Americans, which is why so many Asian Americans sort of disavow that term. Like, it doesn't apply to me. I'm not that. And I think it's a lot of that is the flattening that's happened among, in the news, in what we're taught, in entertainment and so forth. And going back to the Supreme Court decision, which I am dreading, you're right. It is the minority of Asian Americans. Well, it's like East Asian, Chinese, if you think about even within the Chinese, like, as it's oft-cited that, of course, one of the poorest ethnic groups are in New York is Chinese immigrants. So, and Chinese immigrants, but it's the wealthy Chinese immigrants who, first generation, second generation, who are, and maybe some Koreans in there too, who are pushing for that, but it's not, the last time I read, it's like 70% Asian Americans who actually do approve of affirmative action, but we don't hear or read about that complexity among Asian Americans. We don't, like, if we're talking about what we don't know enough of, we don't hear anything about, like, Southeast Asian communities who live in the Midwest, for instance. But anyway, I don't like, going back to your question, I wish there was another word other than allyship. I don't know why, but I have problems with that word, allyship. I hear it quite often, and I think because I hear it quite often, it's a coined term that has lost its kind of urgent luster, and is now seems like more, for whatever reason, seems more like virtue signaling, But I think that, like, when we think about, as much as I understand Asian Americans are, the term is so broad and so disparate that there's also a need to disaggregate Asian Americans, because what, say, someone who is, Chinese immigrant dishwasher is going through is probably very different than what, someone who works in Silicon Valley. So there is a need to disaggregate it, but, like, we have to see, I see Asian American, and I say this repeatedly, as less an identity and more a coalition, and a coalition of very divergent, different groups, who have shared struggles, divergent struggles, but also shared struggles. And it's like really kind of the only way we can sort of make sense of sort of the mosaic that is Asian America, because of all of the differences. And if we see it more as a coalition, then I think it would be easier to understand how that coalition can be built among other immigrants, like other Latinx people, other, Black Americans, Indigenous, and so forth, because it's like a patchwork of connections, of these connected nodes that we're making, and there are some among Asian, like, I was talking to a friend who's Hmong, who grew up in Minnesota, and she said she grew up in the projects with other Black Americans. She has more in common probably with them, with the people who she grew up with, than someone who works in Silicon Valley, so I don't know. I think that when we talk about allyship, we think of it as like someone who it seems very sort of superficial to me, like someone who's completely outside the experience, outside one's experience, the other's experience, and trying to kind of make gestures that are sympathetic and show that they support that person. And I think that's important, but I think it's also important to understand where our shared experiences are and really kind of go from there and think of it as we're not building a bridge from one sort of sealed group to another. I think it's like, it's more important to think of it as we're all, you know, these different coalitions.
I really appreciate that. That's it's a helpful way of framing what solidarity could look like among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So we haven't had the chance to talk about the PI side of that gets incorporated within Asian American studies. But just in thinking about shared experiences, and I really appreciated how you just explained that, Cathy, because then it also allows us to consider how we might expand that towards the other marginalized and subordinated groups, so we can then, as a group, push together for transformative changes that'll advance all of our interests. We have now about 20 minutes left, and we wanted to make sure that we gave the audience a chance to ask some questions and participate in the conversation. So why don't I just pause here and give those in the audience a chance to ask questions or feedback or reactions to some of the conversations we've been having.
So many interesting points being made here. One of the things that really interested me is something that you said, May. One of the things I wanted to follow up with you on, May, is when you said many Asians feel that they have to first say Black Lives Matter before they can talk about their own experience of racism. And you said, I don't think we have to, you know, basically apologize in order to declare our experience. I was wondering if you could expand on that, because you know the whole apologetic Asian stereotype, I think is right there.
It is.
There's a lot under what that need to apologize, and especially that relationship to Blackness, I think is part of that apology. In one of your writings, you use the term racial management, which I find a really fascinating term when you're talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act. So could you unpack the apology for us? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Belinda. Well, I think that we, it's an index of how abject we sometimes are. And I think when our choices are invisible or hypervisibility, then when you're hypervisible, you want to return to being invisible, right? Because it's safer, right? So, so I think there is a stereotype of Asians are always apologizing for troubling things up, messing things up, being complicating things, or being demanding. So I think there is a stereotype that we're always apologizing, but in fact, historically, Asian Americans have stood up for themselves. They've waged struggles. Workers have gone on strike. I mean, a lot of what I write about is the origins of the coolie myth, the myth that Chinese are docile and passive, when in fact Chinese workers have historically organized to improve their wages or their conditions, or protest their exclusion from trade unions or whatever. So a lot of the, I think the stereotype of always being apologetic is connected to the idea that Asians are passive, right? Because if you're passive, then if you try to say something, there's this reflex to apologize for it first. But I think, I think it goes back to the exclusion era, or the time when exclusion politics were rife, when if the charge is you don't belong here, you can never assimilate, you can never be an American, then people say, I'm sorry, I'm an American. So there's like, I'm sorry, I do belong here. And somehow it's hard to separate those things. So I was speaking more of a contemporary problem where so many people assume that Asians are all privileged that we have to say, we have to apologize first for saying no, we also suffer from racism. So racial management I meant as a kind of legal technique, and legal and political form of government. So for African Americans, it became, after slavery, famously, it became segregation, right? Separate but equal. And for Asians, it was exclusion. So there are different techniques of political power. That's what
Can I speak to that? I would say that, first of all, there are plenty of Asian Americans who are very unapologetic, really loud about speaking up about anti-Asian racism, and have been for a long time. There's a long history of that, of loud, angry Asians. But from what I have experienced, just talking to some Asian Americans, especially younger Asian Americans, but actually of, all ages, is I've been, it's this concern that I've been, the pattern of concern that I've heard, which is it okay if I take up space? Or is it okay if I, am I taking up too much space about my own, the racism that's against me? And I think that there's this really internalized assumption that Asian Americans, not some, not all, some Asian Americans that I have talked to feel that the structural racism that they face, whether it's microaggressions or real deep down or discriminatory practices or being spit on in the street, is not it's insufficient. It's not serious enough to attract attention. And and there are a number of reasons for that. You could say it's the Exclusion Act, but I think it's also perhaps sort of the insidious legacy of the model minority myth, which is that there is broad paintbrush where Asians are considered successful when the exceptional minority, when that has the reality can't be further from the myth. It's actually untrue. But it's something that a lot of Asian Americans internalize. Maybe some of it also comes from family too, that, I was reading this great book, Noor Al-Sadir, called Animal Joy. She's a poet and psychoanalyst, and she was saying something really interesting about sort of the survivor sensibility, which is that when you're surviving, when you're trying to survive, you do try to take up as little space as possible. You try to be invisible. You assimilate, you hide, you camouflage. This is what a lot of first-generation immigrants do. The most extreme example of that is when, there's a gun shooting, right? And someone is still alive and they hide, they pretend that they're dead. That's an extreme, and dead among other bodies. That's an extreme example of what you do when you need to survive, is that you play dead. But then we see examples of, but another example of that is, the refugees or immigrants who come here to the new environment. They have, like my parents, have more of a survivor sensibility, which is they assimilate. They just get through it. They get through life. It's not about kind of stirring trouble or anything like that. And it's also possible that there are, second, third generation Asian Americans who have also internalized that sort of immigrant sensibility too, which is that you shouldn't speak up because you're only going to get into more trouble. So I think it's like kind of double-edged. I'm not saying these are not totalizing reasons why this is so, nor is this the majority of Asian Americans, but if you hear it, I think it's because of these common assumptions that Asian Americans don't face racism. That's what a lot of people believe. and probably still believe, despite the anti-Asian hate. And so that Asian Americans internalize that, and maybe some of it is also coming from family and what generation they happen to be in America.
I'm reminded, so just to jump in quickly, I'm reminded of one of the speakers that participated in this panel that Rutgers Law School hosted last spring on anti-Asian violence and how to address that. Jack Chen and I were on the same panel together, and one of the panelists was Liz Kari. She's a second-gen Filipino American whose mother, Vilma Kari, was the one who was assaulted outside of a hotel or an apartment in New York City, and it was documented on video. The doorman didn't do anything, and she spoke about how her mother didn't want to do anything. She was embarrassed. Her mother was embarrassed to be in the limelight and just kind of wanted to hide. Whereas for Liz, she said, no, we have to speak up. We have to do something. So her story reminds me of what you just shared, because there is this, for some, an immigrant mentality, and then the children saying, we do belong and we have to fight back. And so fast forward to a couple weeks ago, the two of them were invited to the White House, and President Biden talked about the need to address anti-Asian violence, and her mother is now much more vocal about demanding the fair treatment and asking for governments, both federal and state, to address ongoing anti-Asian racism that many are experiencing.
Well, why didn't you stop attacking China? That would help.
Should say that.
Well, I think Biden talks out of both sides of his mouth. I don't doubt that he's sincere when he says he's against violence and hatred against Asians. But since the Biden administration continues Trump policy that considers China a strategic adversary, that fuels that same violence that he disavows. And I think that, you know, the competition between the United States and China today is very intense, and it can only lead to bad things. Among them, more hatred against Asian Americans. That's not even the primary thing. That from where we sit, of course, we feel that target on our back. But I think that, you know, the path that both Trump and Biden on the one hand and Xi Jinping on the other are pursuing will lead to no good. That's my opinion.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. My name is Paige Kim. I'm a postdoc here at Rutgers. I have two separate thoughts that I want to sort of share and leads to a question. One of the things that I think has been very limiting for me from a person who is undocumented and also a migrant scholar is that the conversation on anti-Asian American is that hyphenated American, right? So when we think about these racial violence and in our contemporary moment against Asian Americans, I think sometimes the conversation leaves out people who are minoritized within Asian American conversation, which are non-Americans, right? Who are refugees, who are asylum seekers, who are undocumented, or who are in the process of trying to become quote unquote American in a legal sense, right? So I think I wanted to sort of hear a bit more on that tension even within Asian people with such a racial category, like how do we sort of incorporate and change or shift this conversation on anti-Asian American hate when the attack is racialized, right? And another complication I think I see and that I've been having conversation with colleagues and community members is that when we think about the mobilization around Black Lives Matter, the arbiter of violence is very much the state, right? Or even white vigilantes, right? Whereas Asian American attack against Asian people are not always necessarily state enforced, right? It's not necessarily always the police, right? I think I want to sort of expand the conversation on like how do we manage those scalar differences around racial violence feels very tricky for me that I haven't really found a good way to approach, not only like within the conversation between Asian communities, but even inter-race conversations, right, has been a tricky one. My second question is a bit more of an academic conversation. I think I wanted to sort of want to ask both of you, where do you sort of see the change in, or hopefully a change in the conversation around Asian American scholarship to include Black and Indigenous conversations, right? Like when we think about incorporation or belonging, I think right now I sort of see a shift in Black studies and Indigenous studies where they're having more of a conversation with each other, whether it's a historical or even cultural or contemporary mobilization. And I'm trying to figure out where Asian or Asian American studies fit into that, right? Like there is a slight movement towards reckoning with what does it mean to be a settler as an Asian immigrant, but I don't always see the conversation across like Black, Indigenous, Asian experiences and immigration history.
That was a lot. Well, I think on your first point, you know, we all kind of are reduced to these shorthand phrases, like anti-Asian hate, Asian American, and they become a shorthand or a stand-in for all the diversity in our groups. And I think that for Asian, I mean, I consider Asian Americans to include immigrants. Like, I don't limit the idea because in part it's a coalitional idea. It's not actually a racial identity. So when I use Asian American, and I don't use a hyphen in my own practice, I include immigrants, like first generation immigrants in that. But I think it does become murky because when we write, you know, you can't have like a 2-sentence parentheses, you know, to explain everybody that you're talking about, and we kind of resort to these shorthands. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but some of it is, I think, when you actually then are writing something, that you can unfold an argument that makes it clear that you're talking about diverse groups and immigrants and citizens, et cetera, et cetera. On the second point, what was the second question? About scholarship. Well, you know, I think that, okay, so this is where presentism comes in, because I think, you know, I think you should study what you think is interesting to you, yourself, and I think that there are people who work on kind of, especially in urban studies, urban history, who work on projects that are not limited to one ethnic group, and sometimes they involve histories of coalition politics or differences even. But like any academic research that involves, that gets broader, is more research you have to do, right? So you have to learn about all those other things. So that's why, you know, it's daunting, right, to do that. So I would say you shouldn't be forced, right? And I think that, you know, I mean, it depends if you're talking about historical scholarship or contemporary research. I mean, a lot of people I know who are in the social sciences are very interested in intergroup relations, and I think that's entirely a good thing, and that's a positive thing. When you do historical research, I think you have to just figure out like what is your subject, and how does, I don't think you should feel compelled to look for something that crosses over into other groups. That's my opinion. But if you want to do that, then, you know, I have a student now who's finishing her dissertation, and she writes about health activism in Chinatown in the post-World War II years. And it's mostly about Chinatown residents, but it's also about medical professionals who immigrated from Taiwan, who have actually become quite active in Chinatown. But she's also brings in as kind of not as principal actors, but she's also aware of and mindful of and thinks a little bit about the other health activism that was going on in New York at the same time, because the Black Panthers had their free clinics, and the Young Lords Party took over, Lincoln Hospital. I mean, so there are these movements going on, and the people at the time worked with each other. So it's not so much that she's looking for connections to impose on her story. It's actually part of the story that the activists were actually all engaged in coalition building together. So I think that's a more organic way of approaching it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you raised very important points, multiple points. And thank you for that. And I agree with you. I do think there is not enough conversation about undocumented Asian migrants. There's a little bit more about refugees, not enough about undocumented Asians. And for me, my general, my general idea, or it's a very basic one about the future of Asian American conversation, is that we have to constantly center and highlight the groups who are the most vulnerable among us. And so far, I think, if we're basing it on headlines, it seems to be more based on, say, affirmative action and those who are anti-affirmative action, which are Asian Americans who are very privileged and who happen to be East Asian. And what gets buried are the groups who are living under various circumstances, conditions, such as refugees, immigrants who, immigrants, working class immigrants, and undocumented Asians. And I also, there's the question that I bring up. I am not a scholar, so I can't speak to, or a political organizer, so I can't speak to what the conversations are going on. I can only speak as a poet. But I have noticed a dearth in that conversation. It needs to be emphasized. And I also don't understand why, undocumented, the struggle is really centered in Latinx studies and not Asian American studies, because undocumented, there are a big proportion of undocumented migrants who are also of Asian ethnicity, and that is something that we need to seriously address. There are definitely writers who are, like our friend Chen Julie Wang has written a book called Beautiful Country, and that's about her life growing up undocumented. I think that is like a really important book where it's a personal account that raises really essential issues. I mean, if we're talking about who is invisible, it's not Asian American. Asian American undocumented workers are truly invisible, and that was also brought to light, for instance, during the Atlanta massacre, right, with the sex workers who were undocumented, and there's just no conversation about that. There's no conversation about that, and I think that, and there has been more. But what I found sort of frustrating in the aftermath of that was that there wasn't any. It was more about the number of people who died and not about the structural circumstances that led to their killing. So that needs to be very addressed. What was your second question?
Which is sort of about the conversation around Asian American literature or history, like how it should change to incorporate Black and Indigenous content.
Well, I think it is changing, and I can't speak as a scholar. I'm speaking as a writer, as a poet, and I'm actually seeing where, I can be very cynical about American politics, where I'm not cynical, where I'm actually very hopeful about is what's happening in poetry. And so I can only speak to that. And I think that there is actually a lot of support and coalition building and cross-racial solidarity about the story about the storytelling. It's been going on in poetry for a little while. There's been a renaissance of Black poetry, Latinx poetry, Asian American poetry, and unlike maybe politics or scholarship, I'm not sure. There's a lot of overlapping circles where people support each other. There's not that same kind of silofication you're seeing in other disciplines. So I am seeing that. in terms of scholarship, now this is me speaking as an outsider, I'm not a historian. I will say that I personally, I am interested, and this is where I think, say Asian American studies could go and is going towards there, is just cross-racial discipline, which I think there's also, if we're talking about what we're not seeing enough of, what I find frustrating is, and that might sort of be a solution, not a solution, but address some of the conflicts that we're seeing now, is that there has been a long history of cross-racial solidarity between Asian and Black Americans. An example, if you look at labor history, like Filipino migrant workers, and Mexican Chicano workers, and the mid-century who went on strike against dole, that's one example. Or you were mentioning in a previous conversation that we had about Frederick Douglass and how he spoke out against the Chinese Exclusion Act. There are very important moments of cross-racial solidarity that was centered around labor or immigration acts, but people don't know that history. People aren't interested in that history because white people weren't involved. So that, I think, that needs to be amplified more. And I think there's a lot of scholarship that can be had about that, and I think we are seeing more of that too, based on some of the books I see that are about to be published. Yeah.
One of my favorite books in this area that highlights the experience of undocumented Asians is Jose Antonio Vargas's book, Undefined American. He was just here a few years ago, and one of the quotes that I always remember that's so profound is he said, "We are here because you were there, because the United States was there in all these other countries." And that kind of that statement alone helps explain some of why many immigrants are here, why they are undocumented, and it offers a space for engaging in cross-racial solidarity. There's so much more that we can talk about, but I'm afraid we're out of time, and I can see the food over there, and I can hear my own stomach grumbling. So please join me in thanking our speakers today, May 9th.